Leonard Leo has had more influence over the federal judiciary in the past 30 years than almost anyone else alive.
Political bear nation ready to dive, where opinions spark and the debates thrive. Hold on tight.
Hey guys, welcome back. This is Brown Chubby Bear for Political Bear Nation. Today, we're going to be talking about the most powerful conservative man in America that you don't know. I know most of us are thinking about what's going on in Los Angeles right now, but do you think this couldn't happen with another Republican president down the line? Why wouldn't another wannabe dictator send Marines to Chicago, Atlanta, or Detroit just to stomp out a peaceful protest? The real threat aren't the Marines on the ground. It's the judges who say it's legal. And that's why we need to talk about Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. Leonard Leo has had more influence over the federal judiciary in the past 30 years than almost anyone else alive, even more than the President of the United States. You may have heard Leonard A. Leo's name for the first time a few weeks ago when Donald Trump threw a temper tantrum on Truth Social after a federal court ruled that he didn't have the authority to impose many of the tariffs that he announced. Let me just read you a small smidgen of that unhinged rant. I was new to Washington, and it was suggested that I use the Federalist Society as a recommending source on judges. I did so openly and freely, but then realized that they were under the thumb of a real sleazebag named Leonard Leo, a bad person who in his own way probably hates America, and obviously has his own separate ambitions. I am so disappointed in the Federalist Society because of the bad advice they gave me on numerous judicial nominations. This is something that cannot be forgotten. So why is Trump pissed? As of May 1st, according to Bloomberg, there were 328 federal lawsuits filed across the country against nearly every part of Trump's agenda. Out of the 171 cases that have been decided, Trump's administration has only won 43. That's just a 25% success rate. Great for our democracy, but bad for Trump's ego. And it doesn't matter whether the judges were appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. He's been a loser in court, and rightfully so. Trump has and continues to violate multiple provisions of the Constitution. Trump has called for impeaching judges and dismantling legal protections like due process and even habeas corpus. But it was this latest tariff ruling that finally broke the orange camel's back. So now, Leonard Leo is back in the spotlight. And since I released my deep dive on Peter Thiel and Palantir a few weeks ago, I figured it's time we talk about another very rich man who's had way too much unchecked power over this country. To understand how Leonard Leo reshaped the courts, you have to understand the Federalist Society. And to understand the Federalist Society, you have to understand the concept called Originalism. Originalism is the idea that judges should interpret the Constitution based on how it was understood by the people who wrote it, specifically the framers in 18th century America. These judges don't care what the law means today. They care about what it meant in 1789. They believe the only way to preserve the Constitution is to follow its original text strictly, without factoring in evolving values, modern-day norms, or even basic decency. They believe judges who rely on precedent or moral reasoning are guilty of judicial activism. But let's be honest, what they call activism, the rest of the modern world calls progress. Take Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 ruling that ended racial segregation in public schools. Most people see that as a no-brainer. But the Federalist Society has criticized it for relying on modern social science and updated ideas of fairness instead of sticking strictly to what the Constitution meant in 1789. The same Constitution that codified slavery as law and denied women the right to vote. And they've applied that same approach to striking down rulings that protect access to contraception, abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, and same-sex marriage. Basically, anything that reflects the world we actually live in, they don't like. Today, that same logic is being repackaged under a new label, anti-woke. The branding may be new, but the goal is the same. Use the courts to roll back decades of civil rights progress. Now, I'm no attorney, but I did study pre-law and political science in college before switching to graphic design and marketing. And from my very unofficial but very loud opinion, that whole ideology is batshit crazy. because the Constitution was built to evolve. That was the whole concept of the Elastic Clause. Let's look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which is formally called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. It is called elastic for a reason. It stretches. It allows Congress to pass laws needed to address problems the founders could have never imagined. Without the Elastic Clause, we wouldn't have civil rights laws, national infrastructure, public education, Medicare, Social Security, the basic structure of modern government. But the Federalist Society thinks this clause has been abused to create big government programs. They want to roll it all back, shrink the federal government, and hand more power to the states, or so they say. And on the surface, that may sound like a nice return to small government, but in practice, it means one thing: returning power to wealthy white male landowners. Because the original Constitution didn't give rights to black people, women, or poor people. That's the original vision they're talking about. Leonard A founded a Federalist Society chapter at Cornell in 1989. Back then, the FedSoc, as the Federalist Society is commonly called, was a glorified student debate club. By 1991, Leo started working for them while he clerked for Judge Raymond Randolph on the D.C. Circuit, and that's also where he met Clarence Thomas. Now, they became really close friends, and when I mean close, I mean really close. Clarence Thomas even became the godfather to one of Leo's 7 children. Leo even took a break from the Federalist Society to help Clarence Thomas through his brutal confirmation hearings.
Senator, I would like to start by saying unequivocally, uncategorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today that suggested in any way that I had conversations of a sexual nature or about pornographic material with Anita Hill, that I ever attempted to date her, that I ever had any personal sexual interest in her, or that I in any way ever harassed her.
See, at the time, Anita Hill, a former colleague of his, testified that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her while he was her supervisor at the Department of Education. Her testimony shocked the nation and triggered a media firestorm, but the Senate confirmed him anyway. That was Leo's first real taste of the judicial nomination process, and he kind of liked it. After that, he went back to Cornell and transformed the Federalist Society to a conservative judicial machine. He expanded chapters to every major law in America. He built internal databases of judge candidates and hosted massive national conventions. He built relationships with judges, clerks, and legal scholars all across the country. He even brought Catholic conservative values into his legal strategy and turned FedSoc into the GOP's judicial farm system. If you wanted to find a conservative judge to fill a spot in your district, you went directly to FedSoc for a recommendation. Now, let's fast forward to the year 2000. And talk about the 2000 presidential election. So Florida has 25 electoral votes, and the entire presidency came down to the Sunshine State. See, at the time, Bush had 246 electoral votes. Gore had 260, but there was a problem. Florida's ballot design was a total mess. Thousands of voters were confused by something called a butterfly ballot. That's where names were misaligned and kind of hard to read. And on top of that, the state was still using a punch card voting machine. The kind where you physically have to poke a hole in a card, but many of those holes didn't punch through all the way. So what you got were something that we call hanging shads. Little pieces of paper that were half detached but still clinging on. These machines didn't count them as valid votes, so thousands of ballots were rejected. So Al Gore, correctly following Florida law, requested a manual recount in 4 Democratic counties. While this was a totally reasonable and legal request, that became the center of a legal firestorm. The Bush campaign argued that only recounting 4 counties violated the Equal Protection Clause. because the votes were being treated differently depending on which county you lived in. That inconsistency is what ultimately got the Supreme Court involved. George W.'s team was carefully constructed of none other than a bunch of Federalist Society members. Ted Olson, he was lead counsel and was also a founding member of the Federalist Society. He was later appointed as a U.S. Solicitor General under President George W. Bush. Benjamin Ginsburg was a national counsel for the campaign. He, of course, was an active participant in the Federalist Society. He was later appointed to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2013. Ted Cruz, yes, that Ted Cruz. He was 29 and he was a loser back then too, but he was part of the Federalist Society and part of Bush's legal team. And finally, there was Peter Kessler, who was the co-founder of the Federalist Society, and he was on George W.'s team. He went on to hold significant positions within the Department of Justice and was even nominated to the U.S. Court of Appeals, but he was never confirmed. These Federalist Society members convinced the Supreme Court to stop the Florida recount in a 5-4 ruling, handing Bush the presidency.
Strategery.
But it wasn't just Bush's legal team that were members of the Federalist Society. 3 of the 5 justices on the Supreme Court, Scalia, Thomas, and Rehnquist, were all Federalist Society members too. The U.S. Supreme Court overruled the Florida State Court and stopped the recount cold. So much for states' rights. The Federalist Society loves to preach about originalism and states' rights, but when the Florida Supreme Court authorized a statewide recount, suddenly that whole states' rights thing went out the window. FedSoc changed the course of history by handing W the victory. Who knows how the world would have looked if we never invaded Iraq, or if we used SEAL Team 6 to kidnap Osama bin Laden instead of invading the entire country of Afghanistan for 2 decades. But the Federalist Society's grip on America was just getting started. Under George W. Bush, Leo became one of the 4 horsemen advising the president on judicial nominations. He worked alongside John Ashcroft and Brett Kavanaugh, yeah, that Brett Kavanaugh, to pick candidates who passed the Federalist Society purity test. To help get his judicial picks confirmed, Leo created the Judicial Confirmation Network, or JCN, a 501c4 group that could spend unlimited anonymous money to support judicial picks. Leo knew why he was hired, but he didn't do just whatever the president said. He wanted someone that shared his narrow view of the Constitution. He actually used his power to tank Bush's nomination of Harriet Miers and replaced her with Samuel Alito, a Federalist Society favorite. How? Leo activated his network of conservative media figures, columnists, and Federalist Society insiders to launch a coordinated smear campaign questioning Harriet Miers' lack of judicial experience and her loyalty to conservative ideology. Despite being George W. Bush's personal pick and longtime legal advisor, Harriet Miers was buried under right-wing pressure. Leo made it clear his loyalty was to the conservative movement, not to a president. Not even the President of the United States had the power to put someone on the bench who did not toe the Federalist Society line. That's when Leo earned the nickname the Kingmaker, because he could make or break any judicial nomination. The Supreme Court now included Roberts and Alito, both ready to shift the judiciary to the right, far right. First up, Citizens United. In 2010, the Citizens United versus FEC ruling made it legal for nonprofits to spend unlimited amount of money on elections, as long as they weren't coordinating directly with campaigns, but there were plenty of loopholes around that stipulation. The vote was 5-4. Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, and Kennedy, all Leo's guys, formed the majority, and they all believed in the principles of the Federalist Society. Kennedy was the one guy that sometimes strayed away from the path, but for the most part, even he fell in line. In 2013, Shelby County versus Holder dissolved protections meant to stop voter suppression. For decades, 9 states, including Alabama, Texas, and Mississippi, had to get federal approval before making any changes to their voting laws. Why? Because they had a long documented history of racist voter suppression. It was one of the key protections in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it worked until the Supreme Court gutted it. In a 5-4 decision with Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, and Kennedy again forming the majority opinion, the court ruled that the formula used to flag discrimination was outdated and was no longer necessary. Within just hours, Republican-led states started pushing voter ID laws, closing polling locations in black communities, and purging voter rolls. But Leo's influence wasn't just confined to the courts. As a devout Catholic, he also wanted to mobilize religious conservatives to help Bush win re-election against John Kerry in 2004. One of the most infamous pieces of that election was the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth campaign.
If you have any question about what John Kerry's made of, just spend 3 minutes with the men who served with him 30 years.
I served with John Kerry.
I served with John Kerry.
John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
He is lying about his record.
I know John Kerry is lying about his first Purple Heart because I treated him for that injury.
John Kerry lied to get his Bronze Star. I know. I was there. I saw what happened.
His account of what happened and what actually happened are the difference between night and day.
John Kerry has not been honest.
And he lacks the capacity to lead.
When the chips were down, you could not count on John Kerry.
John Kerry is no war hero.
He betrayed all his shipmates. He lied before the Senate.
John Kerry betrayed the men and women he served with in Vietnam.
He dishonored his country. He most certainly did.
I served with John Kerry. John Kerry cannot be trusted.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
It was brutal, dishonest, and wildly effective. They claimed that Kerry did not deserve some of the medals he received, including the Purple Hearts and Silver Star medals, and that he also lied about the stories of his combat. The claims came from individuals who had never even served with Kerry, and the ads on TV were directly contradicted by official military records. But the damage was done. Kerry was no longer a decorated war hero, but a fraud. It was quite literally fake news before fake news was a thing. Creative Response Concepts, or CRC, was the PR firm behind it, and the guy running it was Greg Mueller, a close ally of Leo's. Years later, Leo would take over CRC entirely, rebranding it as CRC Advisors, using that same ruthless, scorched earth strategy to grow his conservative influence. Leo's network didn't just shape the courts, it funded the entire infrastructure around them. Groups like the Concord Fund, formerly the Judicial Crisis Network, became massive financial engines for the conservative legal movement. One of Leo's biggest beneficiaries was a dark money group called One Nation, which was aligned with Mitch McConnell. Leo's network poured $9 million into One Nation, which then spent big money to boost Republican Senate candidates and ram through judicial confirmations.
Sanctuary cities release criminal illegals. Senator Brown voted to protect them. Tell him to start protecting us.
Mitch was a regular speaker at Federalist Society events long before he ever became the Senate Majority Leader. Their partnership hit a peak moment in 2016 when Justice Scalia died and Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland to fill the vacancy. Leo immediately got to work. His network funneled over $7 million into ad campaigns and pressure tactics to block Garland's confirmation.
Meet Merrick Garland. Obama and his liberal allies have been working hard to paint Garland as a moderate for the Supreme Court. But there is no painting over the truth. Garland would be the tie-breaking vote for Obama's big government liberalism. The Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms? Gutted. Partial birth abortion? Legalized. Unaccountable agencies like the EPA? Unleashed. How do we know? Because we have seen Garland's record, and it's not moderate. In 2 separate cases, Garland has demonstrated his strong hostility to gun owner rights. He even sided with the federal government on keeping personal information on anyone who purchases a gun. Unaccountable agencies like the EPA, in a dozen close cases in which the court divided, he sided with the agency every time. According to the New York Times, if Judge Garland is confirmed, he could tip the ideological balance to create the most liberal Supreme Court in 50 years. Moderate? Nice try.
Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell flat out refused to even hold a hearing, claiming the next president should fill the seat.
It's we the people. Sometimes the politicians forget that. The Supreme Court has a vacancy, and your vote in November is your only voice. Senator Pat Toomey agrees. The American people should decide. This isn't about Republicans or Democrats. It's about your voice. You choose the next president. The next president chooses the next justice. Call Senator Pat Toomey. thank him for letting the people decide.
It was one of the most shameless power grabs in modern political history, and it worked. The seat stayed open until Trump took office, and Leonard Leo made sure it went to someone from his list. By 2016, Trump wasn't seen as a true conservative. He praised Democrats for years. He claimed that they were better for the economy and had flipped on positions like abortion several times.
And it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats than the Republicans. Now,
sure, he screamed about immigrants and railed against Obama, but the Republican establishment didn't trust him, and neither did the religious right. So, to win them over, he did something no other presidential candidate has ever done before. He released a list of potential Supreme Court nominees, and that list was personally curated by Leonard Leo. It was a turning point. With one move, Trump gave the Federalist Society the keys to the judiciary and earned the trust of the conservatives who were on the fence. And the moment Trump took office, Leo and Mitch McConnell went to work. Their first major move was Neil Gorsuch.
In 2012, the Denver Post endorsed Barack Obama. In 2016, they supported Hillary Clinton. Today, the Post calls on Senator Bennett to walk away from petty politics and speak up for Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. Bennett has already praised Gorsuch's integrity and intellect. Now, Senator Bennett can remind the nation what leadership looks like. Senator Bennett, it's time. Oppose the liberal filibuster and support a son of Colorado, Neil Gorsuch.
Just 65 days after being nominated, Gorsuch was confirmed, one of the fastest confirmations in recent history. Mitch McConnell used a nuclear option, which changed the Senate rules to allow Supreme Court nominees to be confirmed with a simple majority instead of the traditional 60 votes. Behind the scenes, Leo made sure Gorsuch was ideologically airtight. Leo's dark money machine launched a $10 million campaign through groups like the Judicial Crisis Network, now the Concord Fund, blitzing the media with ads and pressure campaigns to get the confirmation done. Because if you didn't vote for one of his judicial candidates, he'd spend millions getting rid of you in the Congress.
Heidi Heitkamp supports the worst policies from the Obama years. She supports using your tax dollars for abortions, Obamacare, and giving millions in cash to a country that chants death to America. After years of siding with Washington liberals, Heidi Heitkamp has a chance to confirm Neil Gorsuch. Gorsuch treats everyone fairly, and with a record of applying the Constitution just as it was written, he's perfect for the Supreme Court. Tell Heidi Heitkamp, confirm Gorsuch.
Then, in 2018, Justice Anthony Kennedy retired. Leo had his next pick ready, Brett Kavanaugh, a longtime Federalist Society member and an ally going all the way back to the George W. Bush days. The confirmation was chaos. There were even allegations of sexual abuse, even worse than Clarence Thomas. There were protests and national coverage of Kavanaugh's time in college and whether he would have even remembered what he did and if he ever got blackout drunk.
Sometimes I had too many beers. I liked beer. I still like beer. Had beers, have some beers. One beer, drink beer, drinks beer, drank beer, and drinking beer. You've probably had beers, Senator.
Each week, Ralph Club, biggest contributor.
You know, I got a weak stomach, whether it's with beer. I like beer.
For that.
I like beer. I don't know if you do.
Okay.
You like beer, Senator?
Leo's response? Flood the media.
President Trump has nominated another great judge for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. He treats everyone fairly and has a record of applying the Constitution just as it was written. So why won't Joe Donnelly commit to supporting Kavanaugh? Is he more interested in siding with Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren than Hoosiers? Has he forgotten who he represents? Tell Joe Donnelly his vote on Kavanaugh is something you won't forget.
The Judicial Crisis spent over $3 million to reshape the narrative. There were TV and digital ads defending Kavanaugh's reputation. A $1.5 million campaign featured testimonials from old classmates and colleagues, painting him as a principled, stand-up guy. And key Republican senators got hit with coordinated pressure to toe the line and vote for him. Then came Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, just weeks before the 2020 election. Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett, and Mitch McConnell shoved her confirmation through in just 30 days, 8 days before the election. The same guy who refused to hold hearings for Mayor Garland in an election year claimed this was totally different. Sure, Mitch, sure. Leo's network didn't flinch. The Judicial Crisis Network launched a 6.3 million television ad blitz in just 5 weeks. Another $2.9 million went into digital ads, direct mail, and text campaigns, all designed to build public support and twist arms in the Senate. Altogether, Leo's machine funneled nearly $22 million in dark money into Barrett's confirmation. By the end of Trump's first term, Leo had helped install 3 Supreme Court justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, and at least 86 appellate judges. Trump's Supreme Court was Leo's masterpiece, but it wasn't the only thing he worked on. Trump appointed over 220 federal judges during his first term, almost all vetted, screened, or approved by Leo's network. Today, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices have ties to the Federalist Society, and Leo's fingerprints are all over each and every single one of them. Finally, Leonard Leo and the conservative legal movement had the power to do what they've been planning to do for nearly 50 years: overturn Roe v. Wade. On June 4, 2022, the Supreme Court issued its decision on Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization, upholding a Mississippi law that banned most abortions after 15 weeks. The court officially overturned Roe, along with Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which replaced Roe's trimester framework with the viability-based standard and obliterated nearly 5 decades of precedent and wiped out the constitutional right to abortion. This didn't just happen with 1 or even 2 rulings. This was the endgame of a coordinated, decades-long strategy, and Leonard Leo was right at the center of it. He didn't just pick the justices, he built the pipeline, ensuring the right lawsuits were filed in the right states by the right people and heard by the right lower courts. And his network coordinated with state attorney generals, anti-abortion advocacy groups, and carefully selected the litigators. Dobbs wasn't a random case. It was handpicked and delivered to the Supreme Court. Justice Samuel Alito, writing for the majority, claimed that the Constitution doesn't guarantee the right to an abortion because it's not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. The effects were immediate and brutal. 13 states had trigger laws designed to ban abortion the moment Roe was overturned. Mississippi's 15-week ban took effect right away, shutting down the Jackson Women's Health Organization, the state's only abortion clinic. States like Texas, Alabama, and Missouri wasted no time passing near-total bans, cutting off access to reproductive health care for millions of women. And in his concurring opinion, Justice Clarence Thomas openly said the court should revisit decisions protecting contraception access and same-sex marriage. Thomas made it clear this court is coming for other rights next. And thanks to Leo's legal machine, they now have the power and the roadmap to do it. For some conservatives, overturning Roe was the end goal. But for others, especially Leonard Leo, it was just phase 1. The next target? The administrative state. That's the network of federal agencies that regulate everything from clean air to consumer protection. The EPA, OSHA, the FDA, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and more. These agencies write and enforce rules that impact millions of lives. But to Leo and his crew, these agencies represented government overreach by unelected bureaucrats. Their mission was simple: strip them of their power. The first major shot came in West Virginia versus the EPA in 2022. In that case, coal companies backed by conservative AGs, many tied to Leo's network, challenged the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And the Supreme Court's conservative majority sided with them. They invoked a new legal concept called the Major Questions Doctrine, ruling that if a federal agency wants to issue a regulation with major economic impact, it needs explicit approval from Congress. It was a huge blow to climate policy and just friggin' clean air. But that was just a warm-up. A bigger victory came in 2024 when the court, stacked with Leo's picks, overturned the Chevron doctrine. This was a foundational principle of administrative law that had stood since 1984. Under Chevron, courts were supposed to defer to a federal agency's reasonable interpretation of a law when the statute was vague or unclear. It let the experts in agencies fill in the blanks. But anti-regulation conservatives hated that idea. They saw it as a blank check for bureaucrats to make law without accountability. So in Loper versus Raimondo, they finally got the win. In a 6-3 decision, the court killed the Chevron outright. And just like that, decades of legal precedent was gone. Power shifted from agencies stacked with scientists and experts to judges. This is Leo playing the long game, something he's done for 30 years. So how did Leonard Leo pull all this off? He built a 5-layered legal financial machine, a web of nonprofits and for-profit companies designed to move hundreds of millions of dollars into reshaping the courts, suppressing voting rights, and pushing conservative agendas at every level of government. The Concord Fund, aka the Judicial Crisis Network. The Concord Fund, formerly known as the Judicial Crisis Network, it's a Virginia-based nonprofit that operates under the 501c4 status, which means it can spend unlimited amount on politics without disclosing its donors. Leo knows federal courts matter, but state AGs are often the first ones to challenge federal laws or sue the government. So Leo focused on them. That's where RAGA comes in, the Republican Attorneys General Association. RAGA is made up of Republican state AGs, the top law enforcement officers in their states. These are the people who decide what laws to challenge and what cases will end up going all the way to the Supreme Court. Let's get to layer 2, the 85 Fund and Donors Trust. The 85 Fund underwent a transformation in 2020 when Leo and longtime ally Greg Mueller created CRC Advisors, a communications and political strategy firm. Almost immediately after that, the 85 Fund raised $20 million, much of it from Donors Trust, a conservative dark money powerhouse sometimes called the ATM of the right. Donors Trust deserves a separate video in its own right, but basically the group acts as a pass-through entity, moving massive amounts of cash from anonymous billionaires to extremist think tanks and legal attack operations. And then there's layer 3, the $1.6 billion bombshell, the biggest single political donation in U.S. history. In 2021, an elderly Chicago billionaire named Barre Seid handed Leonard Leo 100% of the shares of his company, Triple Light. He didn't just cut a check, he donated the company itself to Leo's new nonprofit, the Marble Freedom Trust. That move helped avoid about $400 million in taxes when the company was sold for $1.65 billion to the Eaton Corporation. Leo's trust walked away with all of that $1.65 billion money. Now there's layer 4, moving the money. In 2022 alone, the Marble Freedom Trust, with Leo as chairman, started deploying its billions. $154 million went to the Schwab Charitable Fund, which then funneled $140 million to the 85 Fund, and the 85 Fund pushed court cases and legal policy. Then $55 million went straight to the Concord Fund to fund judicial nominations and right-wing politicians. There's actually quite a bit more to this layer, but after a while, the numbers just start sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher.
Oh, good grief. Yes, ma'am?
And then here's layer 5, the last piece of the puzzle, the BH Group. So Leo set up the BH Group in 2016. There's no website, there's no office, there are no employees, but somehow between 2016 and 2020, BH Group bought in nearly $13.5 million. So where did the money come from? From nonprofits Leo already controlled. His political groups would raise money from anonymous donors, and then they'd hire the BH Group for consulting services. Which means Leo was essentially paying himself just about in a roundabout way. And this is how Leonard Leo built the most powerful dark money network in America. And it's still running right now. If you consider yourself to be a conservative, I can almost guarantee you that you've been manipulated by Leo in some way. Take, for example, the Bud Light boycott. After the brand featured trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney, the Concord Fund, a fund controlled by Leo, funneled $350,000 into the Woke Alert campaign by Consumers Research. That money paid for digital ads and aggressive messaging, calling it dangerous corporate virtue signaling, sparking one of the biggest anti-trans consumer boycotts in recent memory. Leonard Leo, the man you never voted for and probably never heard of until just recently, didn't have just money behind him. He had allies, powerful ones. Billionaires like Robert and Rebecca Mercer and Peter Thiel, whose military surveillance empire I broke down in a previous video. These connections helped Leo evolve from a kingmaker to a king architect. He stepped away from the Federalist Society and launched something even bigger, the Teneo Network.
I spent close to 30 years, if not more, helping to build the conservative legal movement. And at some point or another, I just said to myself, well, if this can work for law, why can't it work for lots of other areas of American culture and American life where things are really messed up right now? Wokeism in the corporate environment, in the educational environment, one-sided journalism, entertainment that's really corrupting our youth. Why can't we build talent pipelines and networks that can positively affect those areas as well?
Think of Teneo as Leo's next phase. If the Federalist Society was about taking over the courts, Teneo is about taking over everything else: politics, corporations, media, schools, even professional sports. The group has quietly recruited a long list of high-level insiders. Senator Josh Haley, one of Teneo's co-founders, is still involved. So is J.D. Vance, now the Vice President of the United States. Back in 2019, co-founder Evan Baer bragged on video that Teneo had many dozens of members that already placed throughout the federal government, including the White House, the State Department, Justice Department, and the Pentagon.
So let's imagine a world in which Teneans serve in the House and the Senate as governors. One might be elected president. They've founded dozens of successful companies, partners at leading VC firms, sit in tenured faculty positions at elite universities, produced box office hits, and launched dozens or hundreds of strategic and winsome ideological projects.
And thanks to Leo's $1.6 billion from the Marble Freedom Trust, he has the cash to sustain this culture war for decades. Listen, you don't have to agree with my ideology, but you should know who's really pulling the strings and what they're planning next, and think about whether you're being manipulated to hate someone for who they are or who they love, or maybe you're being manipulated into believing that the courts aren't supposed to uphold civil liberties. Because if you have, you're not alone. Even I have succumbed to Leo's media manipulation. And I hope now that you know the truth, you can finally start rethinking the narratives you've been fed and who benefits from them. If you learned something today, please subscribe and smash that like button. Until next time, this is Brown Chubby Bear for Political Bear Nation.
The stories collide, political bears on an untamed ride, roaring through truths, the left and the right, setting the stage for a wild and